The morning started with the kind of interruption that makes Fritz reach for his best carving knife. Not to use it, mind you, but to hold it while he considers the fragility of domestic tranquility. At 9:30, when Mr. Wolfe was upstairs communing with his orchids, and the brownstone was wrapped in its customary morning hush, our doorbell rang with the persistence of a debt collector or a man selling salvation. I was at my desk pretending to find our monthly bills fascinating, which is like pretending to enjoy a root canal, when the bell's urgency convinced me that someone outside had either very good news or very bad manners. The caller turned out to be a delivery boy with a leather pouch, a clipboard, and the kind of schedule that didn't allow for conversation. "Package for Mr. Nero Wolfe," he announced, thrusting a brown paper parcel at me with the enthusiasm of a man disposing of evidence. "Sign here." I signed, tipped him a quarter on the principle that early morning visitors should either leave money or take it, and carried the package inside. It had weight, not like a book, but like something with its own gravity. The return address made my eyebrows climb toward my hairline. Rusterman's, West 35th Street. Now, Rusterman's isn't just another restaurant to Mr. Wolfe. It's a shrine to his late friend Marko Vukcic, and even though Marko has been gone for years, the kitchen still operates with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. When Rusterman's sends you something at 9:30 in the morning, it's either Christmas in October or trouble wearing a bow tie. I took the package to the office and cut the string carefully. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper like a sleeping cat, was a candle. Not just any candle, but a cylinder of ivory beeswax with a brass base engraved with a discreet R. The wick was blackened and stiff, as if it had been pinched out by impatient fingers. Along one side of the candle, the wax bore a smudge. Not quite a fingerprint, but close enough to make you wonder who had been careless with their grip. The candle didn't just smell like beeswax. Woven through the sweetness was something else. Herbs, maybe thyme. It leaned toward my nose like a question mark made of wax. There was also a note. Plain white card, no letterhead, typed on a machine that had seen better decades. It saw him die. Keep it cool, that was all. No signature, no explanation of how a candle had acquired the gift of sight. I gave it exactly 1 minute of contemplation, which is my standard allotment for mysteries that arrive before coffee has worn off. Then I went to the hall and pressed the button that connects to the plant rooms. The house system has different tones depending on your level of presumption. I pressed it with curiosity, seasoned by caution. Yes. The voice from above was calm, resonant, and mildly annoyed at being interrupted during orchid meditation. "Package from Rusterman's," I reported. "It's a candle." Comes with a note claiming it witnessed a death. Instructions are to keep it cool. Silence. The kind of silence that wears reading glasses and thinks hard thoughts. "Put it on my desk," Wolfe said finally, and clicked off. Now, Mr. Wolfe guards his desk like a dragon guards gold. He doesn't invite objects to rest there unless they've been properly introduced and have excellent references. But he'd given the order, so I carried the candle in and placed it where he could examine it without straining his considerable bulk. At 11 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms with his usual measured pace, the way justice moves when it's not in any particular hurry. He settled into his chair, noticed the candle, and regarded it with the expression he reserves for puzzles that have the audacity to exist without his permission. He picked up the candle carefully, weighed it in his palm, and brought it close to his nose. His nostrils flared once, a delicate sampling of evidence. "Beeswax," he pronounced, as if I'd suggested paraffin. "Good quality. Adulterated with thymus vulgaris. Common thyme." Not Fritz's blend. He examined the blackened wick with a letter opener. The flame was extinguished by pinching. Note the ridge along the side. There was a draft in the room when it burned. "Fascinating," I said. "Should I call the candle's references, or would you prefer to interview it directly?" He favored me with a look that could wilt lettuce. Call Rustermans. Ask Mr. Wardak about any unusual incidents last evening. Do not mention the candle immediately. I dialed Rustermans and got Mr. Wardak, the dining room manager, whose English comes measured in precise, careful portions. Mr. Wardak, this is Archie Goodwin calling for Mr. Wolfe. Was there any trouble at your establishment last evening? Perhaps a patron who had the poor taste to expire during dinner. A pause that lasted long enough to brew tea. Mr. Goodwin, there was indeed an incident. Mr. Clyde Bingham suffered what appeared to be a fatal seizure during a private dinner in our blue room. Most regrettable. The police were notified. Was he dining alone? No, sir. A party of 6. There was considerable distress among the guests. We are closed for lunch today as a mark of respect. I see. One more question. Did you send Mr. Wolfe a package this morning? A candle, specifically? Another pause, shorter but more pointed. Mr. Goodwin, we sent nothing. If something of ours was taken from the premises, that would be most concerning. I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe had been listening with his eyes closed, which meant he was thinking at maximum capacity. Someone took our candle from Rustermans, I reported. Clyde Bingham died during a private dinner. 6 people present. The restaurant didn't send us anything. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at the candle with new interest. A candle is not, strictly speaking, a witness, but it is evidence. Someone risked considerable trouble to bring it here. The question is why. Maybe they heard about your reputation for solving impossible cases, I suggested. Or maybe they just like your taste in office furniture. He wrapped the candle carefully in tissue and handed it to me. Put it in the safe. Handle only the base. We'll preserve whatever evidence it may contain. I was placing the candle in our secure safe when the phone rang. A woman's voice, controlled but with an undercurrent of strain. Is this Mr. Wolfe's office? It is. Archie Goodwin speaking. What can we do for you? My name is Beatrice Varden. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe about the death at Rustermans last night. I believe you may have received something that concerns me. We may have, I said carefully. What's your connection to the deceased? I was engaged to Clyde Bingham, and I'm about to be arrested for his murder unless someone can prove what I know to be true, that he was killed by one of the other people at that table. And what makes you think we can help? Because someone at that dinner took something that doesn't belong to them and sent it to the one man in New York who might understand what it means. I need to see Mr. Wolfe this afternoon. I can pay his fee. I looked at Wolfe, who had been listening. He nodded once. 3 o'clock, I told her. And Miss Varden? Don't be late. Mr. Wolfe's patience is not among his renewable resources. After I hung up, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his eyes fixed on the spot where the candle had rested. Finally, he spoke. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him we may need his services beginning this evening, and inform Fritz that we'll be having a guest for afternoon consultation. Something light but substantial. This promises to be a case that will require considerable nourishment. You're taking the case? I'm taking the candle, he corrected. The case, as you call it, appears to be taking me. I grinned and reached for the phone to call Saul. The brownstone's tranquility had been officially disturbed, and from the gleam in Wolfe's eye, I could tell he was looking forward to restoring order in his own inimitable fashion. After all, when someone has the audacity to steal evidence from a crime scene and deliver it to Nero Wolfe's doorstep, they're either very clever or very desperate. In my experience, desperate people make the most interesting clients. At 2:55, Fritz appeared with a silver tray, bearing iced tea and delicate cheese pastries that smelled like they'd been crafted by angels with culinary degrees. Wolfe, who had spent the intervening hours motionless in his chair with a botanical journal, acknowledged the refreshments with a grunt that conveyed both approval and the expectation that civilization would continue to function properly. At 3 o'clock sharp, and I mean sharp enough to cut glass, the doorbell announced our visitor with the kind of precision that suggested Beatrice Varden understood the importance of punctuality in Nero Wolfe's universe. I went to the front door and found a woman who looked like she'd been wrestling with insomnia and losing badly, but had decided to dress for victory anyway. She was tall, probably 5'7" in her sensible heels, with dark hair pulled back in a style that said, "Business first, grief second." Her clothes were expensive, a charcoal wool suit that fit like it had been tailored specifically for her. But there was something in her green eyes that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Her hands, I noticed as I led her to the office, were steady as surgical instruments, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her handbag. Wolfe entered at 3:01, settled into his chair with the ceremony of a judge taking the bench, and regarded Miss Varden with the expression of a man examining a particularly complex orchid hybrid. He didn't speak immediately, which is his way of establishing that conversation happens on his terms, or not at all. "Miss Varden," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of mountains, "you mentioned receiving a message suggesting I possessed something of interest. What makes you believe this object relates to Mr. Bingham's death?" She didn't flinch under his gaze, which earned her points in my personal scorebook. "Because I saw someone take it from our table at Rusterman's. During the confusion after Clyde collapsed, when everyone was either screaming or trying to help, I watched Harold Drummond, Clyde's business partner, pocket one of the candles from our centerpiece. He thought no one was looking, but I was." Wolfe's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline by approximately 1 millimeter, which for him constitutes dramatic surprise. "Mr. Drummond being?" "Clyde's partner in their import business. Bingham and Drummond, specialty foods. They'd been having difficulties lately. Financial ones and personal ones, too. Harold thought our engagement was a mistake that would interfere with business decisions. You were engaged to Mr. Bingham for how long?" 6 months. We planned to marry in April." Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. "Clyde wasn't an easy man to love, Mr. Wolfe, but he was honest, sometimes brutally so. It made him enemies." Who else was present at this dinner? Besides Clyde, Harold, and myself, there was Victor Clem, Clyde's attorney, and Maeve Quinlan, a business consultant who'd been helping with some new contracts, and Peter Arbery, Clyde's cousin. 6 of us total. I was taking notes, but looked up at the mention of the cousin. Family dinner or business meeting? Both. Clyde had just finalized a very lucrative distribution deal. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration, but I think Clyde planned to make some announcements that not everyone would appreciate. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "What sort of announcements?" Miss Varden hesitated, then seemed to decide that half-truths wouldn't serve her purposes. He'd discovered that someone was embezzling from the company. He'd been investigating quietly for weeks. I believe he intended to confront whoever was stealing from him. And the sequence of events at dinner. We'd just finished the main course. Victor Clem had made rather a show of selecting and serving the wine, a burgundy he claimed needed special handling. Clyde had barely touched his food. He was too nervous about whatever he planned to say. Then he stood up, raised his glass, and said, "Before we go any further, there's something we need to discuss." That's when he collapsed. Before Wolfe could respond, the doorbell rang with the insistence of authority. I went to the front hall and found Inspector Kramer standing on our stoop with the expression of a man who discovered his sandwich had been made with stale bread. "Afternoon, Kramer," I said. "Social call?" "Can it, Goodwin? I want to see Wolfe." "Now." I led him to the office, where he took one look at Miss Varden and nodded grimly. "Good. Saves me a trip to find you, Miss Varden." Wolfe regarded the inspector with the patience of a mountain watching weather. "Inspector, you have business with us?" Yeah. You received a package this morning from Rustermann's. The candle's missing from what's now officially a crime scene. The medical examiner found traces of aconitine in Bingham's system. That's Wolfsbane, Wolfe. Highly toxic. Someone poisoned him, and I want that candle. This is my home, Inspector, Wolfe said calmly. You may search it when you return with a warrant. If you have questions, ask them. If you have demands, save them for someone who finds them impressive. Kramer's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. Don't play games with me, Wolfe. A man's been murdered, and evidence from the scene ended up on your doorstep. That makes you part of this whether you like it or not. Then perhaps, Wolfe suggested, you should focus on discovering why someone felt compelled to send me evidence rather than attempting to confiscate it without proper authority. After Kramer left, muttering threats about warrants and obstruction, Wolfe turned back to Miss Varden. Aconitine poisoning suggests someone with botanical knowledge. The symptoms would mimic a heart attack or seizure. Who among your dinner companions would possess such expertise? Maeve Quinlan has a background in chemistry, Miss Varden said slowly, and Peter studied botany in college, though he never did anything with it professionally. Wolfe nodded once. My fee is $500 per day plus expenses. I require a retainer of $2,000. She opened her handbag and withdrew an envelope. I brought $3,000. I want whoever killed Clyde brought to justice, Mr. Wolfe, and I want to clear my name before the police decide I'm their most convenient suspect. As she handed me the envelope, I found myself wondering about a candle that had traveled from a death scene to our brownstone, carrying secrets in its wax like a messenger afraid to speak its message aloud. The brownstone's tranquility had been officially breached, and from the gleam in Wolfe's eye, I could tell he was already planning how to restore order in his own methodical fashion. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes you believe the world might actually make sense, which in my experience is usually when it decides to prove you wrong. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, examining our mysterious candle with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a suspicious diamond. He'd retrieved it from the safe and positioned it on his desk blotter, where it sat like an ivory monument to someone else's secrets. Good morning, Archie. I trust you slept well despite having a potential murder weapon in our refrigerator. Like a baby, I said, settling at my desk with coffee that Fritz had somehow made even more perfect than usual. What's the candle telling you this morning? Wolfe picked up his letter opener and indicated a small depression near the base. Observe this indentation. It's consistent with pressure from a thumb and forefinger. Someone gripped it firmly while extinguishing the flame. The wax retains the impression. He rotated the candle slightly. Also, note the discoloration here along the side. Not soot, but a residue of some kind, possibly transferred from the extinguisher's hands. Poison residue? Possibly. Or something equally revealing. He wrapped the candle carefully in tissue. You will take this to Saul Panzer immediately. He's to conduct a microscopic analysis of any foreign substances, particularly near the wick and along this smudged area. Speed is essential. Inspector Kramer will return with his warrant before noon. I called Saul, who agreed to meet me at his laboratory within the hour. Then Wolfe outlined the day's strategy with the precision of a general planning a siege. While Saul examines our evidence, you will visit Rustermann's. I want to see the blue room exactly as it was during the dinner. Photograph the table arrangement, measure the distances, and determine the source of the draft that created the ridge on our candle. Then you will interview Mr. Drummond at his office. Miss Varden's observation about his behavior requires verification. An hour later, I found myself back at Rustermann's, where Mr. Wardak led me to the blue room with the solemnity of a funeral director. The space was elegant but intimate. Paneled walls, subdued lighting, and a round table that could seat 6 comfortably. The brass candle holder sat in the center, empty now, but with faint traces of soot around one of the 3 sockets. The table was set exactly as you see it, Wardak explained. Mr. Bingham sat here, facing the door, Miss Varden to his left, Mr. Drummond to his right. The others arranged clockwise, Mr. Clem, Miss Quinlan, and Mr. Arbery. I walked the ATD perimeter, noting the air vent positioned above the wainscoting at about 3 o'clock relative to the table. When I held up a napkin, it fluttered gently toward the center, a steady draft that would definitely affect a candle flame. The positioning explained Wolfe's observation about the ridge on our evidence. "Who lit the candles?" I asked. "Our captain, Henri. He always handles the candles personally for private dining rooms." Wardak summoned Henri, a dignified man with the bearing of someone who'd seen every possible dining disaster and survived them all. "3 candles, all lit simultaneously," Henri confirmed. "Good beeswax, steady flames. No problems until—" He gestured helplessly. "The collapse happened so quickly." People were screaming, chairs overturning. In the confusion, I cannot say what happened to individual items on the table. I photographed the room from multiple angles, noting the wine stain on the carpet near Bingham's chair, a dark smudge that suggested something had been spilled and hastily cleaned. The pattern indicated liquid had splashed from the direction of Clem's seat toward the center of the table. After collecting 2 unused candles from Rusterman's stock for comparison, I headed to the offices of Bingham and Drummond on West 28th Street. The building was narrow and old, with stairs that announced every visitor long before they reached their destination. The 3rd-floor office bore gold lettering that had seen better decades, and inside, a secretary with red-rimmed eyes directed me to Harold Drummond's office. Drummond emerged before I could announce myself. A man in his 50s with thinning hair and the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. His handshake was damp, and his eyes darted constantly as if looking for an escape route. "Mr. Goodwin?" "I wasn't expecting anyone today. We're closed, actually, out of respect for Clyde." "I understand completely. I represent Miss Varden in certain matters concerning Mr. Bingham's business affairs. This won't take long." His office was cramped and cluttered, papers scattered across his desk in a way that suggested either extreme busyness or extreme anxiety. The air smelled of stale cigars and something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt, wearing cheap cologne. "Business affairs." Drummond's voice climbed half an octave. "What kind of business affairs?" Miss Varden mentioned that Mr. Bingham had been investigating possible financial irregularities in the company. She'd like an independent review of the books to clear up any questions. The color drained from Drummond's face like water from a broken sink. That's completely unnecessary. Our books are perfectly clean. Clyde was being paranoid lately, seeing problems where none existed. What kind of problems did he think he saw? Drummond fidgeted with a letter opener, his hands trembling slightly. Travel expenses, supplier payments, routine business transactions. He'd hired some investigator to look into our operations, questioning everything. It was affecting our client relationships. Who knew about this investigation? Everyone, eventually. Clyde wasn't subtle. Victor Clem was helping him review contracts. That consultant, Miss Quinlan, was brought in specifically to analyze our financial procedures. Even his cousin Peter knew. Clyde complained to him constantly about his suspicions. I made notes while Drummond continued to fidget. "Tell me about the dinner at Rusterman's. Whose idea was it?" "Clyde's. He said we needed to celebrate the new distribution contract, but I think he really wanted to confront someone. He'd been meeting privately with Victor about changing his will, and he'd asked Miss Quinlan to prepare a complete financial audit. I was certain he planned to accuse someone publicly." "During the dinner, did you notice anything unusual?" "We were all acting strangely." Clyde was nervous, barely eating. Victor was fussing over the wine like it contained the secret of eternal life. Maeve kept checking her watch. Peter seemed angry. He and Clyde had argued before we sat down about Peter's job at the museum. After Mr. Bingham collapsed, did you notice if anything was taken or disturbed on the table? Drummond's pause lasted exactly long enough to be incriminating. Everything was chaos. People screaming, waiters clearing space for paramedics. I couldn't tell you what happened to anything on that table. As I left the building, I reflected that Harold Drummond was either the world's worst liar or an excellent actor pretending to be one. Either way, he was definitely hiding something significant. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe had spent the morning productively. He'd compiled detailed background information on our remaining suspects while I was conducting field work. Victor Clem, the attorney, had recently received an unusually large deposit into his personal accounts. Curious for someone on a fixed salary. Maeve Quinlan's chemical engineering background made her a prime candidate for knowledge about aconitine, and her consulting work gave her access to Bingham and Drummond's financial records. Peter Arbery, despite his botany degree and modest lifestyle, had several outstanding debts that family money could easily resolve. Each of our suspects had means, motive, and opportunity, Wolfe observed, settling into his chair with a glass of beer. The question is, which one had the specific knowledge and nerve to use aconitine, and why they felt compelled to preserve the evidence by sending it to me? Maybe they want to be caught, I suggested. Guilty conscience. Or, Wolfe said thoughtfully, they want someone else to be caught instead. The candle may be evidence, Archie, but it's also a message. Someone is directing our attention very deliberately. The phone rang, and Saul Panzer's voice came through with the satisfaction of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for. Archie, tell Wolfe his candle is more interesting than a $3 bill. I found traces of aconitine in the wax near the wick and something else. Latex residue, like from surgical gloves. Whoever handled this candle was being very careful not to leave fingerprints, but they couldn't avoid leaving traces of the poison. As I hung up, Wolfe's eyes gleamed with the particular satisfaction he reserves for puzzles that are beginning to reveal their secrets. The brownstone's tranquility had been thoroughly shattered, and from the look on his face, I could tell he was planning to restore order in his own methodical, inexorable fashion. The game, as they say, was officially afoot. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that makes you check your watch twice, wondering what disaster is running fashionably late. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, examining Saul's laboratory report with the concentration of a jeweler appraising a suspicious emerald. The candle sat on his desk blotter like an ivory monument to someone else's carefully planned homicide. Saul's findings confirm our suspicions, Wolfe announced without looking up. Aconitine residue in the wax near the wick and latex traces consistent with surgical gloves. Our poisoner was methodical. They wore protection while handling both the toxin and the evidence, which narrows our field to anyone with access to medical supplies and a chemistry textbook, I observed, settling at my desk with coffee that Fritz had somehow made even more perfect than usual. That's only half of Manhattan. On the contrary, it suggests someone with specific knowledge of both the poison's properties and the importance of avoiding contamination. This was not an amateur's work. He wrapped the candle carefully in tissue. You will interview Mr. Clem and Miss Quinlan this afternoon. I want to observe their reactions to direct questions about their expertise and their behavior during the dinner. At 2:30, Victor Clem arrived with the punctuality of a man who bills by the quarter hour. He was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'6" in his expensive shoes, but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room containing fewer than 3 Supreme Court justices. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit tailored to disguise a paunch that spoke of too many business lunches, and his handshake had the calculated firmness of a politician working a rope line. Mr. Wolfe, he said, settling into the red leather chair with practiced ease, I understand you're investigating Clyde's death on behalf of Miss Varden. A tragic loss. He was a valued client. Wolfe studied him with the expression of a botanist examining a specimen that might be either rare or poisonous. You served wine at the dinner. Describe your selection process. Clem's smile was professionally warm and completely empty. I chose a 1959 Gevrey Chambertin from Clyde's own cellar. It required careful handling, 40 minutes of decanting, precise temperature control. I supervised the service personally to ensure proper presentation. Such attention to detail suggests considerable expertise. Wine is a passion of mine, Mr. Wolfe. Clyde appreciated that I shared his standards. Clem adjusted his tie with fingers that weren't quite steady. The dinner was meant to be a celebration, but I suspected it might become something else entirely. You anticipated confrontation? Clyde had discovered financial irregularities in his company. He'd asked me to review all contracts and business arrangements, and what I found was disturbing. Someone had been systematically embezzling funds through falsified invoices and unauthorized transfers. I looked up from my notes. Had he identified the thief? Clem's composure slipped for just an instant. He believed so. Harold Drummond had been handling most financial transactions lately, and the questionable activities traced directly to his oversight. Clyde planned to confront him that evening. In front of witnesses? Clyde believed in public accountability. He thought Harold would be less likely to lie with others present. Clem's expression darkened. It was a mistake. Harold has a violent temper when cornered. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. During the dinner, did you observe any unusual behavior? Everyone was tense. Maeve Quinlan kept checking her watch. She mentioned having another appointment. Peter Arbery seemed angry about his financial situation. And Harold was drinking heavily, which never improved his disposition. What happened when Mr. Bingham collapsed? It was sudden and terrible. One moment Clyde was standing to make his announcement, the next he was convulsing on the floor. I immediately called for medical assistance while the others tried to help. Did you notice anything disturbed on the table during the confusion? Clem hesitated just long enough to be interesting. The wine glasses were overturned. Food scattered everywhere. In the chaos, it was impossible to keep track of individual items. He paused, then added, though I did notice later that one of the candles from the centerpiece was missing. Probably knocked to the floor during the commotion. After Clem left, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his eyes closed in concentration. Mr. Clem is concealing something significant, he announced finally. His story is too carefully constructed, and his knowledge of the missing candle suggests more involvement than he's admitting. At 4 o'clock, Maeve Quinlan arrived with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd rather be performing surgery without anesthesia. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with auburn hair pulled back severely and the kind of intelligence that made you want to double-check your arithmetic. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct, and her patience clearly limited. Mr. Wolfe, I have 20 minutes before another appointment. What do you need to know? Your professional assessment of Bingham and Drummond's financial condition. Precarious. They were hemorrhaging money through poor inventory management and questionable supplier relationships. Someone was definitely skimming funds, but the methods were sophisticated enough to suggest inside knowledge of their accounting systems. You identified the perpetrator? I had suspicions. Harold Drummond had access to all financial records, but Victor Clem, as their attorney, also had complete access to company accounts and had been involved in restructuring several major contracts. Either could have manipulated the system. Wolfe's eyebrows climbed. You suspected Mr. Clem? I suspected everyone with access and opportunity. That's what good consultants do. Her smile was sharp as a scalpel. But Clem had the most sophisticated understanding of legal documents and financial instruments. If someone was stealing systematically, he'd know how to hide it. Your background includes chemical engineering? Chemical process engineering, yes. Industrial applications, not toxicology. She paused, her expression hardening slightly. "Are you implying something, Mr. Wolfe?" "Merely establishing expertise. You would recognize the symptoms of various toxic substances?" "I've seen enough industrial accidents to recognize poisoning, if that's what you're asking." When Clyde collapsed, the symptoms suggested either cardiac arrest or toxic reaction. Given his stress level, heart attack seemed most likely at the time. "But you would know that aconitine poisoning mimics cardiac distress." Miss Quinlan's composure didn't waver. "Wolfe's Bane alkaloids, yes. Difficult to detect without specific testing, and the symptoms mirror heart failure. An excellent choice for someone wanting to commit undetectable murder." After she left, I found Wolfe staring at the spot where our candle had rested, his expression thoughtful. Miss Quinlan possesses both the knowledge to identify aconitine poisoning and the expertise to administer it effectively. Yet her directness suggests either complete innocence or supreme confidence in her ability to deflect suspicion. Before I could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway with his arms folded and the expression of a man who'd discovered vandals in his cathedral. "Mr. Wolfe," he announced with wounded dignity, "someone has been in my kitchen. The thyme jar has been moved, and the contents smell wrong." We followed Fritz to the kitchen, where he indicated 3 spice jars arranged on the counter: thyme, marjoram, and savory. The thyme jar's lid was slightly askew, and when I opened it carefully, the familiar herb scent was tainted with something bitter and medicinal. "When did this happen?" Wolfe demanded. "This morning, while I was in the cellar selecting wine for dinner." The doorbell rang, and when I came up, a delivery boy was already in the kitchen, admiring my copper pots. He left quickly when I appeared, claiming he'd brought mushrooms from Lambert Produce. "Describe him." "Thin, wearing a cap." The delivery box said Lambert Produce, but the lettering looked wrong. Too new, too perfect. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, they held the kind of cold anger that makes sensible people check their life insurance policies. "Someone has violated the sanctity of my house, Archie. They've contaminated evidence in my kitchen and attempted to manipulate our investigation. This transgression will not go unanswered." I called Mr. Wardak at Rustermann's, who confirmed they'd never heard of Lambert Produce and used only established suppliers with decades-long relationships. The fake delivery was clearly reconnaissance. Someone wanted to know what we'd discovered and how close we were to solving the case. "Bag that jar carefully," Wolfe instructed. "We'll have Saul analyze the contents. And call our locksmith. I want every lock in this house changed before evening." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Inspector Kramer appeared at our door 20 minutes later, warrant in hand and suspicion in his eyes. He searched the office, the safe and the refrigerator with the thoroughness of a man looking for his missing dignity, but found nothing more interesting than Fritz's carefully catalogued spice collection. "I know you're hiding something, Wolfe," he growled before leaving. "When I figure out what, you'll be explaining it from a cell." After Kramer departed, muttering threats and taking the contaminated thyme jar as evidence, Wolfe exhaled like a man who'd endured a particularly offensive opera. "The inspector is welcome to that jar," he observed calmly. "Fritz, being a prudent man, maintains duplicate supplies of all essential seasonings in locations unknown to casual intruders." "Decoys now?" I asked. "Insurance," Wolfe replied. "Someone wishes to play games in my house. They will discover that even the condiments here have legal representation." The phone rang, and Peter Arbery's voice carried the kind of urgency that suggested either panic or desperation. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to see Mr. Wolfe tonight. Something's happened that changes everything about Clyde's death. I think I know who killed him and why they sent you that candle." I looked at Wolfe, who nodded once. 8 o'clock, I told Arbery. "And Mr. Arbery?" Punctuality is not optional in this house. As I hung up, Wolfe settled back in his chair with the expression of a chess master who'd just seen his opponent's fatal mistake 3 moves in advance. "The pieces are arranging themselves, Archie. Our adversary has made the error of bringing the battle to my doorstep. By tomorrow morning, I believe we'll understand not only who poisoned Mr. Bingham, but why they felt compelled to preserve the evidence for our examination." The brownstone's tranquility had been thoroughly demolished, and from the gleam in Wolfe's eye, I could tell he was looking forward to rebuilding it on a foundation of absolute, incontrovertible truth. Peter Arbery arrived at 8 o'clock with the punctuality of a man who'd been rehearsing his confession all day and the nervous energy of someone carrying secrets that had grown too heavy for his conscience. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of lean academic build that suggested more time spent with books than barbells. His clothes were museum curator respectable. A wool jacket with leather elbow patches, pressed trousers, and shoes that spoke of careful budgeting and scholarly priorities. Fritz showed him to the office, where Wolfe was examining a botanical journal with the concentration of a man solving the mysteries of chlorophyll. Arbery settled into the red leather chair with the careful movements of someone approaching a confessional. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, his voice carrying the precise diction of someone accustomed to explaining complex subjects to undergraduate minds, "I need to tell you something about that dinner at Rusterman's. Something I observed that the police wouldn't understand, but I think you might." Wolfe closed his journal and regarded our visitor with the patience of a mountain observing weather. "Proceed." I saw who took the candle from our table. It wasn't Harold Drummond, as Beatrice thought. It was Victor Clem. Arbery's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cigarettes. During the chaos after Clyde collapsed, when everyone was either screaming or trying to help, I watched Victor slip one of the candles into his jacket pocket. He was very careful about it, used his napkin to handle it, like he was worried about leaving fingerprints. I looked up from my notes. "Why didn't you mention this to Miss Varden or the police?" "Because Victor's been helping me with some financial difficulties. I owe money, gambling debts mostly, and Victor arranged a discreet loan from one of his clients. If I accused him of tampering with evidence, he could destroy me professionally and financially." Arbery took a shaky breath. "But I couldn't let Beatrice be arrested for something she didn't do." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "You observed Mr. Clem's behavior throughout the evening?" "Yes. He was theatrical about the wine service, more so than usual. He made a show of decanting, tasting, adjusting temperatures. But I noticed something odd." Arbery paused, choosing his words carefully. When he reached across to polish a smudge on the decanter, his hand brushed against Clyde's wine glass. It looked accidental, but Victor's movements are usually very precise. He doesn't make casual contact with anything. You suspect he introduced something into Mr. Bingham's glass. I suspect he had opportunity and motive." Arbery stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "Clyde had discovered that someone was embezzling from the company, but not just Harold. The theft was more sophisticated than Harold could manage alone. Someone with legal knowledge was helping, someone who understood contracts and financial instruments well enough to hide the transfers." "Mr. Clem?" Victor had complete access to their accounts as their attorney. He'd restructured several major contracts recently, always finding ways to reduce their tax burden or improve cash flow. But I think he was also finding ways to redirect money into accounts he controlled. Wolfe's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was processing information rapidly. What was the nature of Mr. Bingham's planned announcement? Clyde intended to expose the entire scheme. He'd hired a private investigator and had documentation proving the embezzlement. But he also suspected there was more. Kickbacks from suppliers, falsified invoices, maybe even clients being overcharged with the excess going into private accounts. Before Wolfe could respond, the phone rang. I answered to find Saul Panzer's voice carrying the kind of urgency that meant he'd discovered something significant. Archie, that surveillance I've been running? Our watchers just got interesting. The tan Plymouth's been replaced by a black Buick, and the driver's someone I recognize. Tommy Corcoran works for a private security firm that Victor Clem's law office uses occasionally. They're not just watching anymore. They're positioning. I relayed the information to Wolfe, who absorbed it with the calm of a man who'd expected complications. "Mr. Aubrey," Wolfe said, "you will remain here tonight as my guest. Fritz will prepare the spare room. I believe your safety may be in jeopardy." "Why would I be in danger?" "Because you possess knowledge that someone finds threatening. Knowledge about financial irregularities, about behavior at the dinner, about who had access to what evidence." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Inform him that we have information relevant to Mr. Bingham's death, but that we require additional time to verify certain details." As I reached for the phone, it rang again. This time it was a voice I didn't recognize. Flat, professional, with the kind of careful diction that suggested either legal training or criminal experience. "Mr. Goodwin, I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you. A certain piece of evidence that was removed from a crime scene. It would be in everyone's best interest if that item were returned to its proper place." "And where might that be?" I asked, signaling Wolfe to listen. "The police evidence room, naturally. Along with any analysis or conclusions you may have drawn from examining it, some investigations are better left to official channels." The line went dead. I hung up and looked at Wolfe, who had been listening with his eyes closed in concentration. "Someone is becoming desperate," he observed. "They've moved from surveillance to direct threats. That suggests we're approaching something they cannot afford to have exposed." Aubrey had gone pale during the phone conversation. That sounded like Victor's voice. He has a very distinctive way of speaking, formal, precise, like he's dictating a legal brief. "Perhaps," Wolfe said. "Or perhaps someone wishes us to think it was Mr. Clem. The voice of guilt can be ventriloquized, Mr. Aubrey. What matters is not who spoke, but who benefits from the message." Fritz appeared in the doorway with his arms folded and the expression of a man who'd discovered additional violations of his sacred kitchen. "Mr. Wolfe," he announced with wounded dignity, "the lock on the cellar door has been tampered with. Someone has been examining our wine storage, though nothing appears to be missing." We followed Fritz to the cellar, where the lock showed clear signs of professional manipulation, picked, not forced. The wine racks were undisturbed, but there were footprints in the dust near the area where Fritz stores his cooking wines and vinegars. "They were looking for something specific," I observed. "Not valuable wines, but something else." "Or," Wolfe said thoughtfully, "they were creating the impression of a search while actually planting something." He examined the area carefully, then indicated a small glass vial tucked behind a bottle of cooking sherry. "Archie, photograph this before we touch it." The vial contained a clear liquid and bore a pharmacy label for digitalis, a heart medication that, in the wrong dosage, could cause symptoms similar to aconitine poisoning. The prescription was made out to Harold Drummond. "Someone is working very hard to implicate Mr. Drummond," Wolfe observed as we returned to the office. "First, the obvious financial irregularities, now planted evidence suggesting he had access to cardiac medications. It's almost insulting in its lack of subtlety. Which means the real perpetrator is either very stupid or very clever," I said. "In my experience, Archie, truly stupid people rarely commit murders that require botanical knowledge and sophisticated planning. Our adversary is clever, perhaps too clever for their own good." Aubrey had been listening with growing alarm. "If someone's trying to frame Harold, and they know I can identify Victor as the one who took the candle, then I'm a threat to their plan." "Indeed," Wolfe agreed. "Which is why you will remain here under my protection until this matter is resolved. Tomorrow morning, you will accompany Archie to speak with Inspector Kramer. Your testimony about Mr. Clem's behavior may be crucial. What about Victor? Shouldn't we confront him directly? Wolfe's smile was thin as winter sunlight. Mr. Clem will be confronted, Mr. Arbery, but not in the manner he expects. I prefer to choose the time, place, and circumstances of such encounters. Patience is often the difference between justice and mere accusation. As Fritz prepared the spare room for our unexpected guest, I found myself thinking about candles that traveled from crime scenes to our doorstep, about wine glasses touched by careful hands, and about the kind of person who would plant evidence in Nero Wolfe's own cellar. The brownstone's tranquility had been thoroughly violated, but from the cold determination in Wolfe's eyes, I could tell he was planning to restore order with the kind of methodical precision that would make our adversary wish they'd chosen a different target for their manipulations. The game was reaching its critical phase, and Nero Wolfe was preparing to demonstrate why disturbing his peace was the kind of mistake that people remember for the rest of their considerably shortened lives. Friday morning arrived with the kind of deceptive clarity that makes you believe the world might actually make sense, which, in my experience, is usually when it decides to prove you spectacularly wrong. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, examining a telegram from Saul with the expression of a man reading reviews of his own funeral and finding the prose inadequate. Van Allen Candleworks confirms our suspicions, he announced, handing me the wire. Miss Quinlan purchased a dozen time-scented candles on October 15th. Cash payment, rush order, specifically requesting olfactorily neutral with culinary profile. I filed that phrase in my mental drawer labeled "People Who Think Words Are Windex" and reached for my coffee. So our chemistry consultant has been shopping for aromatic evidence. Indeed. You will visit Van Allen this morning and obtain samples of their time-scented wax for comparison. Then we will conduct an experiment. The Van Allen Connection. Van Allen Candleworks occupied 2 rooms on East 20th Street that smelled like a monastery where the monks had discovered honey. The proprietor, a woman with forearms like a rower, and the calm of someone who'd spent decades working with hot wax, confirmed Saul's information with the precision of a scientist. Miss Quinlan knew exactly what she wanted, she explained, showing me samples of their culinary line. Time-scented beeswax, ivory-colored, to match existing candles. She emphasized that the scent needed to be subtle, detectable only when heated, invisible when cold. Did she specify a use? Demonstration dinner, she said. Something about environmental aromatics for investor presentations. The woman paused thoughtfully. Unusual request, really. Most people want their scented candles to announce themselves. I purchased comparison samples and headed back to the brownstone, where I found Wolfe had spent the morning productively. Fritz had arranged our dining room to replicate the blue room at Rustermann's. Round table, 6 place settings, 3 brass candle holders, and a small fan positioned to recreate the draft I'd measured. We will test the poison delivery hypothesis, Wolfe announced, settling his bulk into the chair that corresponded to Bingham's position. Fritz, light the candles. Archie, you will play Mr. Clem. The experimental recreation. We ran the scenario 3 times with methodical precision. I handled the wine decanter, reached across to polish an imaginary smudge on the glass nearest Wolfe's position, and observed how the time-scented candle's aroma concentrated at his chair when the fan created the proper draft. The heated wax became pliable, leaving microscopic traces on anything that brushed against it. If the wax were adulterated with aconitine, Wolfe observed, examining the slight residue on the wineglass rim. Contact with warm liquid would dissolve the toxin. The dose could be precisely controlled, and the delivery method would be virtually undetectable. Which means whoever provided the scented candle and whoever supervised the wine service were both essential to the plan. Precisely. Miss Quinlan supplied the weapon, but someone else delivered the poison. Wolfe's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a puzzle solver finding the crucial piece. The question is whether they were collaborators, or if one manipulated the other. Before I could speculate further, Saul called with news that made the morning's discoveries seem simple by comparison. "That surveillance is paying dividends," his voice crackled through the phone. "Victor Clem just met with Maeve Quinlan at his office. Private meeting, lasted 2 hours. When she left, she was carrying a briefcase that wasn't with her when she arrived." Escalating pressure. The black Buick had been replaced by a gray sedan, but the surveillance was becoming more obvious. Either our watchers were getting careless, or someone wanted us to know we were being observed. Tommy Corcoran had been joined by a partner, and they'd positioned themselves with the kind of professional patience that suggested this was more than casual interest. "They're not just watching anymore," I reported to Wolfe. "They're positioning for something." Indeed, our adversaries are preparing for the endgame. Wolfe reached for the phone. "Call Miss Quinlan. Tell her I require her presence this afternoon for consultation regarding her financial analysis of Bingham and Drummond. Be cordial, but insistent." At 3 o'clock, Maeve Quinlan arrived with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd rather be performing surgery without anesthesia, but had decided to dress for a board meeting instead. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely. Her gray suit was tailored for business, and her green eyes held the kind of intelligence that made you want to count your fingers after shaking hands. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the red leather chair with controlled grace. "I assume this concerns more than my consulting work." Wolfe regarded her with the expression of a botanist examining a specimen that might be either rare or deadly. "Your purchase of time-scented candles suggests involvement beyond financial analysis." Her composure didn't waver, which earned her points in my personal scorebook for nerve under pressure. "I purchased candles for a client demonstration. Aromatic environmental controls for investor presentations. Perfectly legitimate business expense. Yet Rustamans uses only unscented beeswax candles. Your time-scented specimens would stand out conspicuously, only if someone were looking for them specifically." Her smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "Are you suggesting I intended to substitute my candles for theirs?" "I'm suggesting you understood the importance of environmental controls in your consulting work. The question is whether those controls extended to controlling Mr. Bingham's final dinner." The measured confrontation. Miss Quinlan crossed her legs and studied Wolfe with the attention of a chess player considering her next move. "Mr. Bingham hired me to analyze his company's financial irregularities. What I discovered was a systematic embezzlement scheme involving multiple parties and sophisticated methods of concealment." Multiple parties. Harold Drummond was skimming funds through inflated expenses, amateur work easily detected. But someone else was orchestrating larger diversions through contract manipulations and offshore transfers. Someone with legal expertise and access to estate planning documents. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Clem?" Mr. Clem had complete access to company accounts and had restructured several major contracts recently. He also handled estate planning for wealthy clients who might require discreet financial arrangements. She paused, choosing her words carefully. When Mr. Bingham decided to confront the embezzlement publicly, I realized the true scope of the theft would be buried if he focused only on Harold's petty larceny. "So you took independent action?" "I took appropriate action to ensure the complete truth would be revealed. Sometimes that requires creative approaches to evidence preservation." Before Wolfe could press further, Fritz appeared with his arms folded and the expression of a man who'd discovered additional violations of his sacred kitchen. "Mr. Wolfe," he announced with wounded dignity, "Inspector Kramer is at the door with papers. He appears to have legal authority and limited patience." Official intervention. Kramer entered with a search warrant and the expression of a man who discovered his parking meter had expired during a murder investigation. He was accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a technician carrying evidence collection equipment. "Afternoon, Wolfe," he said, settling into the office without invitation. "We have reason to believe you're concealing evidence related to the Bingham murder. Specifically, candles that were removed from the crime scene." Wolfe gestured toward his desk with the patience of a mountain observing erosion. "The evidence is precisely where I placed it for safekeeping, Inspector. I trust you'll handle it with appropriate care." Kramer's eyes widened as he saw our carefully preserved candle resting on Wolfe's desk blotter. The technician photographed it from multiple angles before bagging it with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a priceless artifact. "We also found this in Victor Clem's office safe," Kramer announced, producing a manila envelope. "Financial records showing systematic diversions from Bingham and Drummond accounts into offshore holdings. Someone's been very busy with other people's money." Miss Quinlan remained seated throughout the search, her expression unreadable. She watched the evidence collection with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment, showing neither concern nor satisfaction. "Miss Quinlan," Kramer said finally, "we'll need you to come in for questioning regarding your consulting work and your knowledge of the company's financial irregularities." "Of course, Inspector. I'm always willing to cooperate with official investigations." She stood gracefully and gathered her purse. "Mr. Wolfe, thank you for an illuminating conversation. I look forward to seeing how you resolve this complex puzzle." The setup. After the police departed with their evidence and their suspect, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his eyes closed in concentration. The office felt strangely empty without our mysterious candle, but the air still carried the faint scent of time and the heavier aroma of approaching resolution. "She's playing a deeper game than we initially suspected," he announced finally. "Miss Quinlan has been manipulating events from the beginning, using her access to financial records and her chemical expertise to eliminate obstacles while directing suspicion toward convenient targets." "You think she killed Bingham?" "I think Miss Quinlan orchestrated Mr. Bingham's death, but I'm not certain she administered the poison directly. The candle delivery to our doorstep suggests someone wanted my involvement, either to solve the case or to provide intellectual cover for a predetermined conclusion." The phone rang, and Lon Cohen's voice carried the kind of excitement that meant he'd stumbled onto a story that would sell newspapers. "Archie, word's getting around that Wolfe's sitting on something big in the Bingham case. The DA's office is talking about arrests, and there's rumors about financial fraud involving estate planning. What can you give me?" I looked at Wolfe, who nodded once. "Tomorrow at 6, Lon. Wolfe's conducting a gathering that should answer most of your questions. Bring your notebook and your skepticism." As I hung up, Wolfe reached for his beer with the deliberate movements of a man preparing for the final act of a complex drama. "Tomorrow evening, Archie, we will gather our remaining suspects and demonstrate how a scented candle became the instrument of both murder and justice. The brownstone's tranquility has been thoroughly disrupted, but by Sunday morning, order will be restored." The late afternoon light slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point toward tomorrow's reckoning. Our mysterious candle was now in police custody, but its secrets remained locked in Nero Wolfe's formidable mind, waiting for the proper moment to be revealed with a kind of methodical precision that had made his reputation legendary. The game was approaching its climax, and from the cold satisfaction in Wolfe's eyes, I could tell he was looking forward to demonstrating why using his intellectual curiosity as a weapon was the kind of mistake that people rarely survive to repeat. Saturday arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that makes cats pause mid-prowl, sensing something in the air that their whiskers can't quite identify. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, not with his customary botanical journal, but arranging a collection of evidence on his desk like a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. "Good morning, Archie," he rumbled without looking up. "Today we will demonstrate that even the most sophisticated criminal can be undone by their own cleverness." He'd spent the morning dictating 6 carefully crafted invitations, each one tailored like Fritz's best sauce, measured, rich, and just spicy enough to provoke a reaction. The messages were delivered with military precision. Harold Drummond, Victor Clem, Maeve Quinlan, Beatrice Varden, Inspector Kramer, and Peter Arbery were all summoned for 6 o'clock. The bait and the trap. At noon, Wolfe handed me a manila envelope stuffed with photostats, carefully prepared documents that would serve as bait for our increasingly desperate adversary. "Place this in the hall table drawer," he instructed. "Third drawer, slightly ajar. If our nocturnal visitors return, they should work for their intelligence." By 2 o'clock, Saul confirmed the trap had been sprung. Tommy Corcoran's partner had retrieved the envelope from our stoop and delivered it directly to Victor Clem's office. 20 minutes later, Maeve Quinlan emerged from the building's service entrance, the same envelope tucked under her coat. "They are not partners in the traditional sense," Wolfe observed when I reported this development. "They are contingently aligned, Miss Quinlan manipulating Mr. Clem's expertise while positioning him as her unwitting accomplice." The gathering. By 5:30, Fritz had transformed our office into a tribunal that smelled of justice and good coffee. The chairs were arranged in a precise semicircle, each position calculated for maximum psychological impact. At 6 o'clock sharp, our cast assembled with the punctuality of people who understood that Nero Wolfe's patience was not among his renewable resources. Inspector Kramer arrived first, warrant folded in his breast, pocket like an insurance policy. Harold Drummond followed, his nervous energy crackling like static electricity. Victor Clem entered with the composed dignity of a man attending his own execution and determined to critique the arrangements. Maeve Quinlan moved with the controlled grace of a chess player, confident in her strategy. Beatrice Varden took her seat with the careful movements of someone balancing hope against despair, while Peter Arbery positioned himself where he could observe without being observed. Wolfe allowed the silence to settle like dust after an explosion, his gaze moving systematically from face to face with the patience of a botanist examining specimens that might be either rare or deadly. The methodical revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice carrying the weight of mountains, "we are gathered to examine a murder that was both ingeniously conceived and fatally flawed in its execution. Mr. Bingham died from aconitine poisoning, administered through a method requiring considerable planning, specific expertise, and intimate knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology." He gestured toward his desk, where Fritz had arranged the evidence like exhibits in a museum of homicide. Photographs of the blue room table setting, samples of time-scented wax, laboratory reports, and financial documents. The weapon was not merely the candle, but what the candle contained: aconitine dissolved in heated beeswax that would transfer microscopic amounts of toxin to any surface that came in contact with the softened wax. The delivery method required someone with chemical expertise to prepare the weapon and someone else with opportunity to ensure the poison reached its intended target. Victor Clem's composure began showing hairline cracks. "Are you suggesting conspiracy, Mr. Wolfe?" "I'm suggesting manipulation, Mr. Clem. You were used by someone who understood your financial vulnerabilities and exploited them to secure your unwitting cooperation in murder." Wolfe opened a manila folder and withdrew bank statements that made Harold Drummond's petty larceny look like pocket change. These documents show systematic transfers from Bingham and Drummond accounts into offshore holdings, nearly $200,000 over 18 months. The transfers were structured to appear legitimate, requiring legal expertise to create the proper documentation. "Those were authorized asset protection strategies," Clem protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "From your perspective, yes. Miss Quinlan, in her role as financial consultant, provided documentation that made these transfers appear to be sophisticated tax planning when they were actually elaborate embezzlement disguised as estate management." The poison's path. Wolfe's attention shifted to Maeve Quinlan, who had been listening with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Miss Quinlan, your purchase of time-scented candles from Van Allen Candleworks was not for investor presentations, as you claimed, but to create a delivery system for aconitine that would be virtually undetectable. The scent was specifically chosen to mask the bitter aroma of wolfsbane alkaloids while providing a plausible reason for substituting your prepared candle for one of Rusterman's standard unscented specimens. The thyme fragrance would only become noticeable when heated, at which point the wax would become pliable enough to transfer microscopic amounts of poison to anything that brushed against it. Miss Quinlan's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested Wolfe was hitting targets she'd hoped to keep hidden. "Mr. Clem," Wolfe continued, "your meticulous attention to wine service provided the perfect opportunity for poison delivery. Miss Quinlan had observed your rituals during previous business dinners and knew you would polish any perceived imperfection on the glassware. When you reached across to adjust the centerpiece and clean an imaginary smudge on Mr. Bingham's glass, you unknowingly transferred aconitine-laced wax to the rim." "That's impossible," Clem stammered. "I would have noticed." "You noticed nothing because there was nothing to notice. The amount of wax transferred was microscopic, invisible to casual observation. But when Mr. Bingham raised his glass to make his announcement, the wine dissolved the toxin, delivering a lethal dose that would mimic cardiac arrest." The web unraveled. Harold Drummond had been listening with growing comprehension. "So Maeve used my embezzlement and Victor's legal work to cover her own theft, then killed Clyde when he got too close to the truth?" "Miss Quinlan orchestrated a masterpiece of misdirection," Wolfe confirmed. "She used your petty larceny, Mr. Drummond, as camouflage for far more sophisticated theft. She manipulated Mr. Clem's legal expertise to legitimize her embezzlement while positioning both of you as convenient scapegoats. When Mr. Bingham's investigation threatened to expose the entire scheme, she eliminated the threat using Mr. Clem as an unwitting instrument of murder." Maeve Quinlan finally spoke, her voice carrying the calm precision of a chess player announcing checkmate. "Clyde Bingham was destroying his own company with paranoid investigations and reckless accusations. Someone had to take decisive action to protect the legitimate interests of the business." "And your own interests, Miss Quinlan," Wolfe observed. "Your consulting fees were contingent on Bingham and Drummond's continued operation under management that wouldn't scrutinize your financial manipulations too closely." The final piece. Inspector Kramer leaned forward. "What about the candle that was sent here? Who took it from the crime scene?" Wolfe's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "That, Inspector, reveals the fatal flaw in Miss Quinlan's otherwise excellent plan. She removed the candle herself during the confusion following Mr. Bingham's collapse, intending to preserve evidence that would implicate Mr. Clem while establishing her own cooperation with justice. She sent it to me because she required an independent investigation that would uncover the financial fraud while directing suspicion away from her own role in orchestrating it. Miss Quinlan calculated that my reputation for analytical precision would result in a thorough investigation that would satisfy the authorities while positioning her as a cooperative witness rather than the primary perpetrator." Miss Quinlan's composure finally cracked, revealing a flash of cold fury. "I wanted to see if you were as clever as your reputation suggested, Mr. Wolfe." "You were. The error in your reasoning, Miss Quinlan, was assuming that intellectual vanity would override analytical precision. You believed you could manipulate my investigation by controlling the evidence I examined. You failed to consider that evidence, properly analyzed, reveals truth regardless of the investigator's preferences or the criminal's intentions. Justice served." Inspector Kramer stood with the satisfied expression of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. "Maeve Quinlan, Victor Clem, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. Mr. Clem, Your cooperation in testifying against Miss Quinlan might influence the charges you face. As the police led away our suspects, Quinlan with dignified composure, Clem with the broken expression of a man discovering he'd been dancing to music he couldn't hear, the office gradually returned to its customary tranquility. Fritz appeared with dinner, lamb chops that had never been contaminated with anything more dangerous than rosemary, vegetables that grew in honest soil, and wine that contained nothing but fermented grapes and the promise of peaceful digestion. The brownstone's tranquility has been restored, Wolfe announced, cutting into his lamb with surgical precision. Justice has been served, truth has been revealed, and our dinner remains mercifully free of botanical complications. I raised my glass in a mock toast, to candles that witness more than they should, and to criminals who mistake cleverness for wisdom. Indeed, Archie, and to the immutable principle that evidence, properly examined, always reveals more than its creator intended. Outside, the October evening settled over West 35th Street with the calm of a world where justice, however complex its delivery, eventually finds its target. The brownstone stood solid and peaceful, its windows glowing with warm light, its secrets safely resolved until the next time someone made the mistake of disturbing Nero Wolfe's carefully ordered universe. The candle that had witnessed a murder was now evidence in a case that would send its creator to prison, but its testimony lived on in the methodical precision of Wolfe's analysis and the inexorable logic of truth properly pursued. Some evidence speaks louder than witnesses, and some witnesses see more clearly in wax than in flesh. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes you believe the world has been scrubbed clean overnight and hung up to dry in perfect October sunlight. The brownstone had that particular hush that wasn't silent so much as digestion. The house was working over what it had swallowed and finding it on the whole satisfactory. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, not examining evidence or plotting strategy, but reading a first edition of Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler, with the contentment of a man whose universe had been restored to its proper order. The morning papers were stacked beside his chair, Lon Cohen's story in the Gazette leading with the headline, "Candlelight's Path to Murder," which was either brilliant journalism or evidence that headline writers had been sampling the cooking sherry. Fritz's coffee tasted like he had interviewed each bean individually and hired only the most qualified candidates. The morning mail included a check from Beatrice Varden with a note expressing gratitude that managed to be both heartfelt and properly restrained, exactly the kind of correspondence that makes taking murder cases worthwhile. Official satisfaction. At 10:30, Inspector Kramer called with the satisfaction of a man whose case had been gift-wrapped by someone with excellent taste in ribbon. "Quinlan's singing," he reported, his tone grudgingly respectful. "Turns out she'd been skimming from multiple clients, not just Bingham and Drummond. Used her consulting work to identify vulnerable businesses, then manipulated their books while positioning convenient scapegoats. The DA says it's the most sophisticated embezzlement scheme he's seen outside of Wall Street. And Mr. Clem? Cooperating fully. Claims he had no idea his legal work was facilitating theft. Thought he was providing legitimate asset protection services. The DA believes him mostly. He'll face fraud charges, but not murder. His law license is toast, but he'll avoid the chair." Wolfe listened with the expression of a botanist cataloguing specimens. Miss Quinlan's cooperation suggests she understands that intellectual pride is a luxury she can no longer afford. "She asked me to tell you something," Kramer continued. "Said you were everything your reputation claimed, and that she'd underestimated the difference between cleverness and wisdom. Thought you might appreciate the distinction." After Kramer hung up, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his eyes fixed on the spot where our mysterious candle had rested throughout its brief but eventful residence. The client's gratitude. At noon, Fritz announced Beatrice Vardon. She had slept, and it showed. Grief had been pressed and ironed, not out of existence, but into lines that fit her face. She sat in the red leather chair with both hands on her purse, as if it might decide to bolt. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I owe you my life, or at least the part of it that wasn't already being ruined by suspicion." "You owe my fee," Wolfe corrected with characteristic precision. The less extravagant of the two. She managed to smile and handed me an envelope containing payment for services rendered plus a generous bonus that would keep Fritz in butter until spring. "I can't pretend the relief isn't selfish," she admitted. "It's not just that I won't be arrested. It's knowing Clyde wasn't undone by the people we suspected for their obvious failings, but by someone with the intelligence to use expertise for cruelty." "Intelligence is a blade," Wolfe observed. "It is indifferent to the hand that wields it. Virtue lies in the selection of use." Domestic restoration. Fritz appeared after Miss Vardon's departure with an update delivered in the tone of a general reporting successful fortification repairs. The locksmith had rehung the cellar door with military-grade hardware. The kitchen had been fumigated of its time imposture. The duplicate spice caches had been inventoried, blessed, and, for all I knew, anointed with holy water. "Mr. Wolfe," he intoned with wounded dignity finally healing, "I have removed all scented candles from the premises, even the orange clove ones for Christmas." "You will return the orange clove," Wolfe instructed. "Citrus is not a crime, only its misapplication." Fritz exhaled like a saint reprieved and departed to restore seasonal aromatics to their rightful place in his carefully ordered universe. The philosophical resolution, over lunch, trout meunière that had been persuaded through moral argument and butter to achieve perfection, Wolfe expanded on themes that had been occupying his considerable intellect since the case's resolution. Miss Quinlan possessed formidable intelligence, he reflected, cutting his fish with surgical precision. But she failed to understand that intelligence without ethics becomes mere cunning, and cunning without wisdom inevitably defeats itself through the very cleverness that initially seems to ensure success. "She almost pulled it off," I pointed out. "If she hadn't sent us that candle, the police might have settled for arresting Drummond or Miss Vardon." "She almost succeeded precisely because she sent us the candle, Archie. Her plan required my involvement to provide intellectual legitimacy for her predetermined conclusion. She calculated that my reputation would satisfy the authorities, while her manipulation of evidence would direct my investigation toward convenient targets. But she miscalculated your stubborn insistence on actual facts. She miscalculated the fundamental nature of genuine analysis. Evidence examined honestly reveals truth regardless of the investigator's preferences or the criminal's intentions. The candle, intended as a silent witness, supporting her narrative, became a vocal accuser revealing not just the murder method, but the entire web of manipulation surrounding it. Evening reflection. As the October light began its gentle fade toward evening, Wolfe descended from his afternoon session with the orchids and settled into his chair with the contentment of a man whose world had been properly ordered. Fritz served dinner with the ceremony of a priest conducting mass. Lamb chops that had been raised on honest grass, vegetables that grew in uncontaminated soil, and wine that contained nothing but fermented grapes and the promise of peaceful digestion. "The brownstone's tranquility has been fully restored," Wolfe announced, reaching for his evening beer. "Our uninvited guests have been permanently relocated. Our evidence has been properly catalogued by the authorities, and our dinner contains nothing more dangerous than Fritz's excellent seasoning. And our bank account has been substantially improved by Miss Vardon's generosity," I added, filing the last of the case documents. "Indeed. Justice served and bills paid, a satisfactory conclusion to a case that began with presumption and ended with proper understanding. The final word." As we settled into our evening meal, Wolfe offered his concluding observations with the measured cadence of a man who had examined truth and found it adequate. The candle that witnessed Mr. Bingham's murder ultimately served justice better than its creator intended. Miss Quinlan believed she could season truth with deception, flavor facts with manipulation, and serve the result as genuine analysis. She failed because evidence, like a properly prepared meal, reveals its true nature when subjected to methodical examination. To candles that see too much, I said, raising my glass, and to criminals who mistake cleverness for wisdom. Indeed, Archie. And to the immutable principle that precision, whether in the preparation of a meal, the cultivation of an orchid, or the commission of a crime, ultimately reveals its own nature. Truth, like a persistent weed, will find its way through even the most meticulously paved falsehoods. Outside, the October evening settled over West 35th Street with the calm of a world where justice, however complex its delivery, eventually finds its proper target. The brownstone stood solid and peaceful, its windows glowing with warm light, ready for whatever mystery tomorrow might bring to disturb its carefully maintained tranquility. The case was closed, but its lesson would endure. That intelligence without integrity is merely cunning, and cunning without wisdom inevitably defeats itself. In Nero Wolfe's universe, that principle was as reliable as Fritz's cooking and as permanent as the brownstone's foundation, a truth worth preserving in a world too often satisfied with convenient lies and comfortable deceptions. Some evidence speaks louder than witnesses, and some witnesses see more clearly in wax than in flesh. The candle that had traveled from crime scene to our doorstep had completed its testimony, leaving behind only the faint scent of justice properly served, and the satisfying knowledge that even the most sophisticated deception cannot survive the methodical application of honest analysis to observable facts. The brownstone breathed deeply and settled into its evening rhythm, content in the knowledge that order had been restored and truth had prevailed, exactly as it should be in any civilized universe worth inhabiting. Monday morning arrived as with a kind of crystalline tranquility that makes you believe the world has finally learned to operate according to reasonable principles, which in my experience usually means it's saving up something spectacular for later in the week. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, not examining evidence or plotting strategy, but polishing his collection of ancient Greek coins with the methodical precision of a man whose universe had been restored to its proper order. The morning mail included official confirmations that justice was proceeding along its appointed channels. A courier from the DA had delivered a neat receipt for 1 beeswax candle, brass base marked R, along with a request for Wolfe to make himself available for clarification of technical points. Wolfe dictated a reply that clarified nothing except his availability at his convenience, which was, he specified, limited and conditional. The final evidence. Saul Panzer arrived at 10:30 with a folder and the expression of a man who enjoys seeing all the pieces fit together with mathematical precision. "Your kitchen intruder was Tommy Corcoran," he reported before we'd even settled into the office. "Prints on the cellar latch match his employment records, and the lab found aconitine traces in that decoy time jar Fritz prepared. The Lambert produce stencil was cut on equipment in Quinlan's shared office suite. I got that from a guy who maintains their equipment for cash." Wolfe accepted the folder with the grace of a mountain receiving a tributary. "And the typewriter analysis?" "Smith Corona portable with a chipped R key. Same defect appears on correspondence found in Miss Quinlan's apartment. Her landlady was cooperative when I explained the situation involved murder rather than unpaid rent." I cut Saul a check and called Inspector Kramer with the typewriter information. He received it like a man finding money in a coat he hadn't worn since Easter, suspiciously pleased but willing to accept good fortune. "If that note is definitely Quinlan's work, we can tie her directly to evidence tampering and obstruction," Kramer said. "She'll claim she was preserving evidence for analysis. We'll call it curating a convenient narrative. Character resolutions." At noon, Mr. Wardak appeared with a package wrapped in the kind of reverent care usually reserved for religious artifacts. "For Mr. Wolfe," he announced, placing the box on my desk, "with Rusterman's gratitude for the restoration of our establishment's dignity." Inside was a new brass candle holder set, 3 sockets perfectly balanced, and 3 pristine beeswax candles, ivory and unscented. The accompanying card was elegantly simple: "For dining rooms where only the meal should provide aromatics." Wolfe inclined his head precisely 1/8 of an inch. "Convey my appreciation to your chef," he told Wardak, "and suggest he abandon marjoram with veal. It represents a philosophical betrayal of both ingredients." Peter Arbery arrived at 3, looking 10 pounds lighter in spirit if not in actual weight. He'd traded cigarettes for gum and carried himself with the relief of a man who discovered that telling the truth, while initially terrifying, had unexpected benefits. "The museum approved my conservation grant," he announced, settling into the red leather chair only after Wolfe's nod of permission. "I can repay Victor's loan and start fresh. More importantly, I've given Inspector Kramer a complete statement. He thinks I'll make a credible witness." "You will not embellish," Wolfe instructed with characteristic precision. "Men in courtrooms mistake themselves for dramatists and destroy justice with unnecessary rhetoric." Peter smiled, a quick, grateful expression. "I'll stick to observable facts. And Mr. Wolfe, Beatrice asked me to tell you she can breathe again. People frequently resume normal respiratory function after I complete my work," Wolfe observed dryly. "It is not a service I advertise, but it appears to be a consistent side effect." Harold Drummond appeared at 4 without appointment, and with the expression of a man who discovered his life's work had been built on quicksand. He didn't sit, instead standing before Wolfe's desk like a student awaiting judgment. "I'm finished," he said simply. "Out of the company, out of excuses, probably out of New York. Kramer says cooperation might keep me out of prison. Beatrice sent a note that didn't mention forgiveness, which I suppose is fair. I may go to Cleveland. They have bakeries there, and I can count loaves without stealing them." "Learn to count in public," Wolfe advised without rancor. "Fraud flourishes in shadows and dies in daylight." The deeper analysis. After the parade of visitors concluded, Wolfe set down his coin-polishing cloth and fixed his attention on the empty space where our mysterious candle had rested throughout its brief but eventful residency. "The candle's arrival here, Archie, the message, the timing, the method of delivery, reveals layers of calculation that extend far beyond simple self-preservation." I looked up from filing the last of our case documents. "You mean Quinlan's master plan was more complicated than just framing Clem and clearing herself?" "Considerably more sophisticated. Miss Quinlan understood that the police would eventually uncover the aconitine, that the financial trail would lead back to her, regardless of how many convenient scapegoats she provided. Her embezzlement scheme, the manipulation of Drummond and Clem, these were not her primary strategy, but elaborate misdirection designed to delay and confuse." Wolfe reached for his beer with the deliberate movements of a man organizing complex thoughts into precise language. "Sending the candle here was not Plan B, but the culmination of her original design. It was an act of intellectual arrogance disguised as a plea for justice. She didn't merely want to be cleared of suspicion. She wanted her cleverness to be recognized and appreciated by a mind she considered worthy of the challenge. She wanted you to admire her work. She wanted validation from her intellectual peer. The message, 'It saw him die,' was not simply factual reporting, but subtle boasting. She was presenting me with her masterpiece of murder, daring me to dissect its complexities while simultaneously hoping I would appreciate its elegance. I considered this while filing the last folder. That's a pretty twisted way to pay a compliment. Indeed. It reveals profound narcissism, a belief that her intellect was superior to law, morality, and consequence. She believed that by involving me, she could control the narrative, that the sheer brilliance of her method would somehow mitigate the moral outrage of her crime. She wanted me to confirm her cleverness, even as I condemned her actions. Professional aftermath. Inspector Kramer called at 5 with his final report. Quinlan's cooperating fully now, giving up a network of similar operations in 3 states. Turns out your case broke open something much larger. The DA wants to know if you'd consider consulting on related cases. The answer remains no, Inspector, Wolfe replied firmly. We solved one murder, not an entire criminal enterprise. I have no interest in becoming a professional fraud investigator. Figured you'd say that, Kramer chuckled. But the offer stands. This thing's bigger than anyone realized, and your methods impress some important people. After Kramer hung up, Wolfe returned to his coin collection with the expression of a man who'd completed a satisfying meal and was ready for dessert. Fame is a burden, Archie, but competence properly applied will always attract more work than can be reasonably accepted. The key is maintaining the distinction between what one can do and what one should do. Restoration and reflection. Fritz served dinner with the ceremony of a priest conducting evening mass. Beef bourguignon that had been convinced through patient argument and Burgundy to achieve perfection, vegetables that grew in honest soil, and wine that contained nothing but fermented grapes and the promise of peaceful digestion. Miss Quinlan's fatal error, Wolfe reflected, cutting his beef with surgical precision, was believing that intellectual admiration could supersede moral accountability. She presented her puzzle expecting congratulations for its complexity. Instead, she received the inevitable consequence of using brilliance in service of cruelty. The moral being. That some candles, like some people, reveal more in their stillness than in their flame. True wisdom lies not in the complexity of one's schemes, but in the clarity of one's purpose. Miss Quinlan possessed formidable intelligence but lacked the wisdom to understand that cleverness without ethics becomes mere cunning, and cunning without conscience inevitably defeats itself. As the October evening settled over West 35th Street, the brownstone breathed deeply and resumed its natural rhythm. The replacement candles from Rustermann's sat in their box like soldiers awaiting parade, innocent, unscented, ready to witness nothing more sinister than Fritz's dessert service and civilized conversation. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one, tiny staged dawns for the evening. Inside, our only flame burned pure and honest, illuminating nothing more complex than good food, honest work completed, and the satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served with methodical precision. The candle that had witnessed murder was now evidence in a case that would dismantle a criminal network. But its most important testimony was complete. That evidence examined honestly reveals truth regardless of the investigator's preferences or the criminal's intentions, and that integrity, unlike reputation, cannot be borrowed, stolen, or counterfeited. The brownstone had been violated, investigated, and restored. Order had been disrupted and methodically rebuilt, and in his chair, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the comforts of his carefully constructed world, Nero Wolfe had once again demonstrated that intelligence properly applied in service of justice was the most reliable force in an unreliable world. Some lessons are worth more than money, but it's particularly satisfying when both arrive in the same envelope, which, given the estate settlement check that arrived with Tuesday's mail, they occasionally do. By Thursday, the brownstone had found its rhythm again, the kind of steady, civilized beat that makes you believe steam heat and human nature can coexist without one scalding the other. Fritz's kitchen smelled like butter minding its own business, the locks clicked with crisp certainty, and the orchids upstairs were back to being the only prima donnas allowed on the premises. I found Wolfe in the office at 9 sharp, not examining evidence or plotting strategy, but polishing his collection of ancient Greek coins with the methodical precision of a man whose universe had been restored to its proper order. The morning mail brought official confirmations that justice was proceeding along its appointed channels. A receipt from the DA's office for one beeswax candle, brass base marked R, quote, and a request for Wolfe to make himself available for clarification of technical points. He dictated a reply that clarified nothing except his availability at his convenience, which was, he specified, limited and conditional. The broader consequences. Inspector Kramer called at 10:30 with the satisfaction of a man whose case had spawned enough additional arrests to keep the department busy until Christmas. "Your Miss Quinlan's cooperation is paying dividends," he reported. "We've identified similar operations in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Turns out she was part of a network of consultants who specialized in identifying vulnerable businesses and systematically looting them." "How extensive?" I asked, taking notes that would never see a courtroom but might interest Lon Cohen. 17 confirmed victims so far, maybe more. The pattern was always the same. Get hired as a financial consultant, identify the most convenient scapegoat, then manipulate the books while positioning someone else to take the blame. Clyde Bingham was unusual only because he got suspicious before she could finish and disappear. Wolfe listened with the expression of a botanist cataloging a particularly invasive species, and the legal profession's response: house cleaning with enthusiasm. "Clem's cooperation is helping us understand how the lawyers got manipulated, convinced they were providing sophisticated asset protection when they were actually facilitating elaborate theft. His license is suspended, but he's avoiding murder charges." Character resolutions. At noon, Beatrice Vardon arrived, not as a client this time, but as someone settling accounts with the past. She'd sold Clyde's share of the import business and was establishing a foundation for financial literacy education, a practical memorial that would have pleased him. "I keep thinking how easily it could have been prevented," she told Wolfe, settling into the red leather chair with the composure of someone who'd made peace with grief. "If people understood what to look for, if Harold had been honest about his problems." "Prevention requires vigilance," Wolfe observed. "Most people prefer trust to suspicion, which is admirable in personal relationships and catastrophic in business arrangements." She handed me a final envelope. Not payment, but a contribution to what she called the Brownstone Tranquility Fund. The check was generous enough to keep Fritz in butter until spring arrived with its own complications. At 3, a courier delivered news that Harold Drummond had indeed relocated to Cleveland, where he was managing a bakery and discovering that honest work, while less lucrative than embezzlement, offered the considerable advantage of allowing him to sleep through the night. Peter Arbery had received his conservation grant and was spending his days restoring medieval manuscripts with the kind of meticulous care that suggested he'd found his proper calling. The philosophical heart. After the day's visitors departed, Wolfe set aside his coin collection and fixed his attention on the empty space where our mysterious candle had rested throughout its brief but eventful residency. Miss Quinlan's fatal error, he reflected, was believing that intellectual admiration could supersede moral accountability. She presented her puzzle expecting congratulations for its complexity. Instead, she received the inevitable consequence of using brilliance in service of cruelty. "She wanted you to appreciate her work," I said, filing the last of our correspondence. "She wanted validation from what she considered her intellectual peer." The message, "It saw him die," was not simply factual reporting but subtle boasting, presenting me with her masterpiece of murder while hoping I would appreciate its elegance even as I condemned its purpose. Wolfe reached for his evening beer with deliberate movements. "Intelligence without integrity becomes mere cunning, Archie, and cunning without conscience inevitably defeats itself through the very cleverness that initially seems to ensure success." The traditional conclusion. Fritz appeared at 7:15 to announce dinner with the ceremony of a priest conducting evening mass. Tonight's offering was lamb chops that had been raised on honest grass, vegetables that grew in uncontaminated soil, and wine that contained nothing but fermented grapes and the promise of peaceful digestion. The dining room had been restored to its proper function, the replacement candles from Rustamans standing innocently in their brass holders, ivory beeswax, unscented, ready to witness nothing more sinister than civilized conversation and Fritz's dessert service. As we settled into our meal, Wolfe offered his concluding observations with the measured cadence of a man who had examined truth and found it adequate. "The candle served its purpose," he said, cutting his lamb with surgical precision. "It carried truth from the scene of deception to the place where truth could be properly examined. In that sense, it was a more reliable witness than most humans. It could not lie, could not be intimidated, and could not change its testimony to serve convenience. Just goes to show," I said, "that sometimes the best witnesses are the ones that can't talk back." Indeed. Evidence speaks most clearly when it is not trying to justify itself or protect its reputation. The candle simply was. It existed. It contained traces of what had happened to it, and it revealed those traces to anyone with the knowledge and patience to examine them properly. The final wisdom. Outside, the November evening settled over West 35th Street with the calm of a world where justice, however complex its delivery, eventually found its proper target. The streetlights came on, one by one, tiny staged dawns for the approaching night. Miss Quinlan possessed formidable intelligence. Wolfe continued, savoring his wine. In different circumstances, applied to legitimate purposes, her analytical abilities might have served society rather than preying upon it. The tragedy of criminal intelligence is not that it exists, but that it chooses to serve destruction rather than creation. I raised my glass in a mock toast. To candles that see too much, and to criminals who mistake cleverness for wisdom. Indeed, Archie. And to the immutable principle that truth, like a properly prepared meal, reveals its essential nature when subjected to methodical examination. Evidence, unlike reputation, cannot be borrowed, stolen, or counterfeited. It simply is, waiting for the proper mind to interpret its testimony. The brownstone breathed deeply and settled into its evening rhythm, content in the knowledge that order had been restored and truth had prevailed. The candle that had witnessed murder was now evidence in files that would prevent future crimes, but its most important testimony was complete. That integrity, properly applied, will always overcome deception, no matter how cleverly disguised. Some candles illuminate more than their immediate surroundings. In some cases cast light on principles that extend far beyond their specific circumstances. The brownstone stood solid and peaceful in the November night, ready for whatever mystery tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that intelligence applied with integrity remained the most reliable force in an unreliable world. As Fritz cleared the table and I prepared the evening's correspondence, Wolfe offered his final observation. "The difference between a candle and a lie, Archie, is that one burns to be useful and the other burns to be seen. We shall always prefer the former." And with that philosophical flourish, the case of the candle that witnessed a murder drew to its proper close, not with trumpets, but with the quiet satisfaction of truth properly served and justice methodically delivered in the civilized confines of a brownstone where even the condiments had legal representation.